Joseph Rowntree Foundation was right to say today, and I quote, that the government has repeatedly committed to levelling up our country, but with 1 in 8 workers trapped in poverty, and many of them hardest hit by the pandemic, many will be in disbelief that there was no bill to protect them announced today, and I would very much agree with the GRF in that respect. So another legislative session without an employment bill means yet another year without neonatal leave and pay provisions in the statute books, something that this government has promised and something in which there is indeed a clear cross-party support right across the House. Now, we all know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that a Queen's speech is a statement of intent about government priorities, and it's clear that strengthening employment rights is not a priority for this British Conservative government. In fact, it appears that the Tories care more about introducing draconian voter ID laws to suppress election turnouts in poorer areas than introducing paid leave for parents, just like myself, whose babies at times have been fighting for their lives on neonatal units every single day. So, no employment bill means no making good on promises around neonatal leave and pay. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, no employment bill means so much more. It means a failure to outlaw fire and rehire, a campaign which has been spearheaded by my honourable friend from Paisley and Renfrewshire North. It means a failure to legislate for flexible working. It means a failure to reform the inadequate statutory sick pay system, which was found utterly wanting during the height of the pandemic. And at this critical moment in time, as we emerge from the pandemic, immediate action is needed in all of these matters, yet the lack of urgency from this British government couldn't be in starker contrast to that of the SNP in Scotland. Now, my party recently published a comprehensive plan for the vital 100 first days of a new government, key social and economic actions to provide serious governance when it is most needed. We've got an immediate plan to support youth employment and invest in better, greener jobs. We will make flexible and family-friendly practices in opposition to fire and rehire processes criteria in the Fair Work First programme, and we'll give the hardest hit businesses the help they need to support local economies as they tentatively reopen. But the lack of urgency or action in this Queen's speech on the stuff that really matters to people is precisely why the Tories were once again roundly rejected at the ballot box in Scotland, indeed, and have been at every election since the 1950s. However, this unequal union consistently limits Scotland's ambition, and our people have now expressed their desire to be able to choose a different future and a different path away from a failing and tired Westminster government they did not vote for. Last Thursday...
David Linden, you are the MP for Glasgow East and you are the spokesperson for work and pensions in the Scottish National Party.
I am indeed. Yep.
Thank you so much for coming on.
It's great.
First question I'd like to ask you is, please tell us about your early life and growing up in Glasgow.
Yeah, I had a very typical upbringing in terms of my constituency. I was brought up by a single parent in a council house. I left school at 16. I didn't go to university. I actually went and did an apprenticeship, but grew up in a very working class community. It would be fair to say that nobody in my family was particularly political or indeed religious. So the path that I took was obviously one that was very different to the rest of my family. But yeah, that was it, and kind of essentially fell into politics, albeit at a very young age. But my upbringing wasn't particularly remarkable, to be honest. It was very similar to that of my constituents.
Thank you for talking about that. And throughout your life, your early life in particular, you've worked as a national conveyor, worked as a parliamentary assistant. So what were the factors that made you make the decision to go into politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be fair to say that, you know, I was very political at a young age. I joined the SNP when I was 11 years old, so that was in 2001. But I had no intentions of working in politics. To be quite frank, you know, if you wanted a career in politics, you didn't join the SNP. The SNP wasn't particularly popular back in the early 2000s in the city of Glasgow. So I was quite happy to kind of volunteer for the party, and, you know, professionally, as I say, I left school at 16. I went and worked in a credit union, and then a by-election came up a couple of years later, and I had the opportunity to go and work for the local MP at the time. But I certainly, I had no intentions of working for the party, and I certainly had no intentions of ever being elected. The idea of being elected as a member of parliament seemed like such a far-off idea that would never happen. And to be honest, I was probably quite uncomfortable also with the concept of standing for election, partly because I'm a Christian, but partly also just due to some confidence issues that I had as a young man. So it was very much an accident, really, that I became a member of parliament.
Thank you for talking about that. And you've actually made some really powerful speeches in the House of Commons with regards to Christian persecution and many other topics. So what do you think that the UK government can do to support religious freedom in countries such as Pakistan, North Korea and Nigeria?
Yeah, I mean, all those countries, I think, are places where Christians, but not just Christians, people of other faiths as well, find it utterly intolerable to live out their religious belief. I've certainly, as you've touched on, I've put quite a fair amount of effort into trying to raise the plight of the persecuted church, certainly in the case of Nigeria, thinking specifically of young Leah Sharibu, who's currently held captive by Boko Haram. So I think it's really important that the UK understands that it has a role on the world stage, that it can stand up and advocate for persecuted religious communities. Now, I don't take the view that we should go back to the days of the empire where the UK runs everything, and my own politics would suggest that's not a good idea. But I think that the UK does have an ability to be a critical friend to a number of these countries. One that I would think of, for example, would be India, with which we're seeking to do a free trade agreement. So I think it's really important that the UK uses that soft power to try and make sure that countries are ensuring that freedom of religion and belief is a fundamental right that we enjoy in the United Kingdom, but a fundamental right that people across the world should enjoy, and ultimately people should have the freedom to believe whatever they want.
Thank you for touching upon that, because it's just nice how you can bring up the cases such as Boko Haram and all of these other situations that are really pressing issues in society at the moment. So another question I wanted to ask you was, the Prime Minister has said that there's not going to be a Scottish independent referendum at the moment, following the SNP having a very positive result in the latest Scottish election. What do you think an independent Scotland would look under SNP leadership? And do you think that we are better together as opposed to Scotland being separate from the UK?
I'm going to surprise you here. I've been a member of the Scottish National Party for 20 years. So no, I don't think that we're better together. I think there's a serious point to this, Micah, that Scotland is a nation, and I believe that nations are best served when they govern themselves. I think that the United Kingdom government's position on the issue of an independence referendum is one that is increasingly untenable. The Conservative Party at the last election in Scotland put out leaflets saying, only a vote for the Scottish Conservatives can stop India F2. That is a second referendum. But people didn't vote, for a Conservative government. In fact, I think the Conservatives only got about 20% of the vote. In reality, a majority of members of the Scottish Parliament were elected on a mandate of holding an independence referendum. And so there's a very clear question the UK government must answer, that, what is the path to people in Scotland democratically choosing whether or not they still wish to remain in the United Kingdom. Now, we in the SNP and the Scottish Government believe that an independence referendum should be held, because fundamentally the UK that Scotland voted to remain a part of in 2014 no longer exists. We no longer have a AAA credit rating. We are no longer members of the European Union. Indeed, the Better Together campaign in 2014 laughed at the idea that Boris Johnson would be Prime Minister. So, if you ask me why I believe in Scottish independence, it fundamentally comes down to an issue of democracy. That, I believe that people in Scotland should get the government they vote for. But the sad reality is that Scotland has not voted by majority for a Conservative government since the 1950s. 70 years ago was the last time that Scotland voted in majority to have a Conservative government. But since then, we've been saddled with Conservative governments that we didn't vote for. We've been saddled with Conservative Prime Ministers we didn't vote for, and that includes Boris Johnson, who people in Scotland feel utterly disconnected from, and they feel that he does not represent their views or their values. So I think it comes back to that basic question for the government, is that if people in Scotland no longer wish to be part of the union, what is the way in which they can express that? And if the UK government won't allow a referendum, then it seems to me that it's not a union that is held together by consensus. And that's why I think it's increasingly untenable. And the UK government will have to grant a referendum and ultimately grant the people of Scotland the opportunity to choose who holds their future. Is it a government they vote for in Edinburgh, or is it a Prime Minister in a party that they've not voted for 70 years?
Well, that argument was very, very well put together. I never expected, such a good answer, but I understand why the SNP is popular, and you made a lot of good points there. One thing that I'd like to touch on about your life is your daughter Jessica Linden. She was born premature, and she spent several months on portable oxygen. How did this affect you in terms of your mental health? And what advice could you give to parents that are going through similar things?
It's a hugely personal thing to have gone through, and I've spoken about it very publicly. Both of my children actually were born premature. My son is Isaac. He was in hospital for probably the kind of 2 to 3 weeks. So all of my paternity leave was basically spent in hospital. But yeah, in the case of Jessica, which is my youngest, she's 2. Jessica was in hospital for quite a long time when she was born, and then she spent basically the first year of her life on oxygen. Now that was quite restrictive for us as a family in terms of how we get about. Carrying a canister of oxygen on your back is obviously quite challenging. But in terms of mental health, I think it more than anything, it just started to kind of grind us down a little bit. Because we were limited, for example, we couldn't go on holiday. Obviously, we're recording this interview just now whilst we're still at the height of the coronavirus pandemic. But back when Jessica was born, simple things like being able to go on holiday, go and visit folk were much easier to do. But it was a lot harder to do when you had a child on oxygen. It also got quite challenging as well when she started wanting to crawl. We have I've mentioned, we have a 5-year-old son who was forever running about the house and would trip over the wire. So quite often we would find that her oxygen had been disconnected from the machine. That wasn't, in any way life-threatening. But I think it was just this feeling that it was never going to end. But, the thing that I would pivot to on that, though, is to say that, yes, it was challenging from a mental health point of view. But I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe He's my Lord and Saviour, and I do believe ultimately that God is in control. And so for me, it was a case of praying every day that my daughter's lungs would develop sufficiently that she would no longer require oxygen. And that beautiful, miraculous moment came actually on the day of my birthday, when we were told that we could disconnect her oxygen, that she was fine, she had passed her sleep study. So I think that's a real testimony to God's goodness and God's faithfulness, that here was something we prayed for that would come to fruition, and it did. But it was a very, very challenging time. But I look at her now, and she's you would never know she'd been on oxygen or been born premature. She runs rings around me in the park, and she's the one that tires me out. It's often it's me that's probably the one that needs oxygen now, given how energetic she is. But it was a very trying time. There's no doubt about that. But glory to God that he came through and answered our prayers.
People were aware that in Glasgow we're seeing an increase in the virus due to the so-called Indian variant. That means, therefore, that although everybody in this house is celebrating the return to indoor hospitality, many Glaswegians have not been able to experience that today, which we bitterly regret. But up until 6 o'clock yesterday, there were still flights coming into the UK from India, with 20,000 people arriving in the UK since the India alarm was raised about that variant. Does the Secretary of State really want to turn round and look Glaswegians in the eye and say that that was decisive action that has led to them staying in Tier 3?
Well, the history as he describes it is in fact wrong, because we put India on the red list and therefore required hotel quarantine before this variant was designated as even under investigation, let alone a variant of concern. So yes, we did take that preemptive action, and anybody arriving who's been in India in the last 10 days now must go into a hotel in order to quarantine.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story with me and with our audience, and particularly drawing upon your Christian faith. It's always nice when you can have a politician that is a devout follower of God. Outside of politics, you love fishing. So what life lessons can you share with young people that you've learned from fishing?
Well, I think actually a lot of, that's a very pertinent question about how does fishing relate to young people. I was actually a bit older in life when I took up fishing. It's not something I did in my teenage years. But I think, if anything, fishing teaches me to be patient. I turned 31 last week. So I'm part of a generation that's used to kind of summoning a pizza by pressing an app on your phone. You can order things on Amazon, other brands are available. That things just arrive almost instantly on the next day. So my generation of young people is probably used to getting everything immediately. And that's not how fishing works. You've got to be patient. And sometimes things, sometimes you don't catch fish. Sometimes you can be fishing in an area where there are no fish. So I think it's one of those good life lessons, just to learn to be patient. And I do think that a lot of people would probably be a lot happier in life if they had mastered the art of patience. And certainly fishing for me is something that teaches me to be patient, and also just to kind of appreciate the beauty of the environment around about me as well. There's nothing better for kind of admiring God's handiwork and goodness when you're standing in the kind of serenely quiet middle of a river with your waders on. All you can hear are the birds and the fish jumping out of the water. I think that there's a real life lesson in that, and it takes you away from the busyness of a kind of city and the hectic aspects of life. Patience and serenity is probably the thing that I learn most from fishing, which is important in a job like mine. You've got to be able to withdraw from the rowdy House of Commons sometimes to kind of gather your thoughts and decide what matters to you in life and what you want to pursue in your job.
Thank you for that answer. Really interesting how you related that, not just to young people, but to the life of a politician as well. So that was a really, really good answer. Following on from this, let's say that Scotland wins the independence next. If there's another independence referendum, Scotland wins it. What will the SNP look like after that? Because there have been parties such as the BNP, UKIP, and when Britain left the UK, UKIP was not as strong. Nigel Farage's party is not as strong. So how will Scotland adapt? Let's say that how will Scotland adapt, and ultimately how will the Scottish National Party adapt after, let's say, Scotland wins and they become independent?
I think that's an excellent question. I would politely suggest that there are massive differences between, for example, the SNP and UKIP or the BNP. The SNP is a left of centre social democratic party. When I joined the SNP and signed up to the kind of constitution of it, the two top things are independence for Scotland and then the furtherance of all Scottish interests. The journey doesn't finish just with Scotland becoming independent. In many respects, the journey really only starts because that's the stage at which you can build a fairer country. That's the stage where you can decide that you don't want a country that invests, billions of pounds in nuclear weapons. You don't want a country that is going to just follow American foreign policy and go into the next war that comes along. You're going to go into government with real taxation powers and make sure that you have a taxation system that is fair, that is progressive, and that isn't burdensome for the lowest earning in society. So yeah, I mean, the raison d'etre of the SNP is to achieve independence for Scotland, but that's not the end point for us. We want to ensure that we have a Scotland that's, for example, welcoming to asylum seekers and refugees. At the moment, immigration policy is something that's decided by the United Kingdom government that we didn't vote for. So that's why we have the hostile environment. That's why we have dawn raids where asylum seekers are dragged out of their houses and sent back to countries where they've experienced famine, sexual violence, and all other aspects of malnutrition. So I think that, independence just gives us the opportunity to pull the levers ourselves. Now, there's no doubt that the SNP is a very, what we would call a very broad church. There are people who are very left-wing. There are people who are probably perhaps more centrist. Whether they all remain in the same political party after independence remains to be seen. But the common thread that we all have at the moment is this belief that the people who live and work in a country should make decisions about that country. But from my point of view, I mean, I'm perfectly comfortable and at home in the SNP. That social democratic left of centre politics is very representative of my own politics. But there's no doubt that there'll be a battle of ideas in the SNP after independence, but I think that's a good thing. I think that's something that encourages and enriches the political discourse of a country, and something that genuinely excites me.
Yeah, thank you again for that answer. It's actually really interesting to hear your views on that, particularly on how the SNP will adapt, which is really interesting. Following on from this, I'd like to also ask you, Scotland is such a beautiful country with amazing scenery and fantastic history. So what case would you put forward to families that might be considering a staycation in Scotland?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, Scotland is just an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful country. I mean, some of those kind of rolling hills and mountains genuinely do take your breath away. But the other thing that I would say as well is that I feel sometimes, and you would expect me to say this as a member of Parliament for Glasgow, I don't represent, the scenic Scottish Highlands. But we have a city with some of the friendliest people in the world, who want to welcome people to their restaurants, to their bars, to their shops. We also have a city that is just steeped in real history in terms of industry. So I would very much encourage people that, that this year, as we encourage people to think about staying at home, i.e. not going abroad, come to Scotland, come to Glasgow, because ultimately people make Glasgow. So come and enjoy our city, enjoy our hospitality, and spend some money here as well, because it's good for our local economy.
Thank you for that. And one of the last questions I'd like to ask you is, COVID has expedited the hybrid working model. So lots of employers have had to now work from home and get their staff. So how soon do you think it will be before we have a 4-day working week?
Well, I think the 4-day working week is certainly something worth looking at. I mean, from my own point of view, as a member of Parliament, I employ 7 staff. And from what I look at, in terms of how I structure my office and kind of my team operates, I don't think there's any suggestion, for example, that a 4-day working week would not work. I'd be very keen to try that. There have been plenty of examples actually that show that when you move to a 4-day working week, because people have got a much better balance between home and work life, that they're actually more productive when they're in the office, or indeed if they're working from home. So if there was a way of moving to a 4-day working week that is good for people to have a stronger amount of time with their family or their friends, but also to be more productive in the workplace, I think that's beneficial for both the employee and the employer. So I'm very open-minded to the idea of going to a 4-day working week. It was actually something that we were going to trial in my own office just before the pandemic started. And obviously the pandemic came along and it made it a bit more difficult to start trying to experiment with your working practices. But I think as we move through what has been a very successful vaccination programme, that employers, need to look at different ways of working. Now, some of that might be how we work from home, but I think we should also look at things, for example, at 4-day working week, because the evidence does suggest that productivity goes up, and that can only be a good thing for everybody.
Thank you again for the answer. And the last question I'm going to ask you is, besides from politics, did you ever think at any other time in your career or your life that you might want to try something else? Or has it always been politics?
But no, so I had no intention of becoming a politician. I at one point actually resisted it. I was asked to stand for election and said no. My lifelong dream until I became an MP, which I do believe is the best job that I've got and will ever have. But my intention had been to actually become a police officer, because I quite like the idea of, I've always been drawn to the idea of playing a role in my community. So, I get to do that now as the local member of parliament. But the idea of being a police officer, which was to kind of keep people safe and be an integral part of the community, was something that was really appealing to me. It didn't come to pass in the end, and then now, because I've been a member of a political party for the best part of 20 years, I wouldn't be allowed to be a police officer. One of my kind of dream volunteering jobs over and above being an MP would probably be to be a special constable, but because I'm a member of a political party, I'm in a politically restricted job, so I'm afraid that boat has probably sailed. But no, I had no intention of ever being a politician. I actually wanted to be a police officer. So that's my secret, I guess.
Thank you for sharing that. That's actually really interesting, very different from becoming an MP. But I'd just like to say thank you for such a really interesting interview. I've thoroughly enjoyed interviewing you, particularly learning about the SNP, and you've put some very good arguments forward. So thank you for putting them forward. Well,
thank you, Micah, for having me. It's been wonderful, and I just very struck by your first name. When I became a member of parliament and I spoke in the House of Commons for the very first time, giving my maiden speech, I actually quoted from the book of Micah. It was chapter 6, verse 8, which is to act justly, walk humbly, and love mercy. So always a good reminder to think of that when I see your name.
Thank you so much for coming on the platform, and please just continue to do the amazing work that you are doing in the SNP.
That's great. Thank you. Have a good day.
The beginning of lockdown was that many of my asylum-seeking constituents who have no recourse to public funds were very much left behind in the original lockdown. What work will the government right across the United Kingdom be doing to make sure that we liaise with the Home Office to ensure that no one's left behind, because after all, COVID does not adhere to people's nationality?
Yes, we have a programme underway to ensure that those without an NHS number can get vaccinated, because the NHS number is the basis of the calling system to invite people to be vaccinated. But of course, not everybody has an NHS number, and we need to ensure that those without an NHS number get called forward too.